Hi, everyone. Welcome to Blick Facebook Live with Prismacolor. Today, I'm going to do a demonstration in the drawing of an eye using Prismacolor color pencils. And you'll be able to ask questions along the way in the chat. A little bit about myself. I'm FLuX. I'm a fine artist and illustrator and a comics artist and creator. I've worked with different clients commercially like Apple and FX and Peace and some musicians and all kinds of stuff. And I also have paintings exhibited in galleries around the world. And I use different kinds of media. I use digital, pencil, pen and ink, acrylic, oil. But when I do get the occasion to use colored pencils, Prismacolor are my go-to just because of the vibrancy of color and the blending ability that they have. So hopefully we can get some good stuff done today, and maybe I can share some tricks and tips with you. This is fairly straightforward, so it shouldn't be too difficult. And with that, I guess I'll get started. If we can switch over to the other camera. So if you've been kind of following along from the Facebook page, there may have been a reference photo that you could use. This is it. I printed it fairly small. And any of these materials you can ask about in the chat, or they are listed as part of the bundle in the chat and also on the Facebook page. But just to mention a few things, with the picture, your reference, I usually print it out fairly small. The reason being is because it's a lot easier to work from small to large, you know, as far as where the eye goes and seeing shapes and things like that. So it really comes in handy. If you get too close to something, it's hard to see the overall shapes. And the first tool I'm going to be using is a 2H pencil. It's essentially the difference between H pencils and B pencils. For those of you who don't know, H pencils are a hard lead, so it's really light. It's great for drawing sketches because then you could easily either erase, or when you take a picture or scan your artwork in, those lines tend not to show as much. So I'll use that to kind of get started here. And essentially, what I'm going to do is look at my picture and kind of figure out, okay, most people who have never done this before are thinking, where do I start? I'll start with the biggest shape there, the obvious one. So I'm going to start with this eye shape, the oval. And it's like an almond shape, you know. It's got a bit of a ridge down on the right-hand side. And I'm going to kind of bring it to a point here. You notice there's a little bit of a tear duct there, so I'm going to leave a shape for that. And then start with the bottom part of the eye as well and kind of bring that up. And the thing is if you notice, I'm doing overlapping strokes very gently, very loosely. You know, I don't want, it doesn't have to be super perfect. The reason being is because we can erase if we want to. And I'm going to go a little bit darker because it looks like it's a little hard to see on camera. But at least you get the idea. So I've got this shape in there. Then I'm going to go ahead with the eye itself, the pupil. And kind of one little trick too is when you're trying to figure out where to start the next part of your drawing, look at it in relation to everything else. So I'm kind of figuring like this is the halfway point of the eye, and the pupil starts a little bit over. So if I go like this and think about where the halfway point of the eye is and go a little bit over, that's kind of where my eyeball is going to start, my pupil. And again, I'm just using overlapping strokes. It's kind of messy, and that's totally okay. And then what I'm going to do is put in the center of the eye. And again, just loosely putting it in there. Now, one thing I'm noticing is like my right-hand side looks a little different now that I put in my pupil. And again, this is all part of it. So as you're going along, go ahead and erase things that you need to. I'm using the magic eraser. You can use a kneaded eraser. That works just as well. And if you've used it before, you might want to do a little, rubbing off on the paper on the side somewhere where it's not going to get messed up. And because a lot of times the graphite can get stuck to that eraser. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust this to kind of where the eyelid comes down and bring this bottom part down here. Okay, so now I've got my sort of revised eye. I I don't want to forget the highlight, and that's that little, white spot in the middle there. So I'm going to put that up there, just a placeholder. That's really all that I'm doing now is just putting in placeholders. So now I'm going to go ahead and start with the eyebrow. So right above, you can see the eyebrow kind of starts right about here, ends a little over to the left. And I'll start by just putting in this overall shape. I'm not worried about the hair, the hair follicles or anything like that. Really just thinking in terms of big, bold shapes. And this is a nice reference to work with. A lot of times you can get a reference, obviously, that you don't have a lot of big, bold shapes with. So if you can find one, if you're just beginning, I would recommend it. Something that it's just got a lot of contrast, and again, big, bold shapes. So now that I've got that, there's this eye makeup that comes up just under the eyebrow. So I'm going to go ahead, before I even get there, start with the upper eyelid. So I can kind of bring this down a little bit, right? And get that upper eyelid in there and bring that down. So I'm slowly adding some detail as I go along and adjusting things as I go along. So, okay, this, eyebrow is a little bit higher than I thought. All right. And again, coming down here at the top of the eyelid, bringing that shape up, and now I can get in the rest of this red shape over here. All right. So hopefully you all can see this. I'm going to pick it up a little bit so you can see it. All right. So I'm moving along. Now I'm going to go ahead and bring in this other shape, this other blue shape that's underneath the eye. Again, this eye makeup makes it really fun to draw because it gives me a lot of shapes to work with. Depending on what you're drawing, you can find pictures of your own. This is actually a free picture found online. Or if you want to create your own to work with, then you have a lot more flexibility. All right, so I've now put in this bottom part. I've got my basic shapes in there. So I think I'm pretty good to go. And, you might say, look at the picture and think that there are differences, and that's fine. It doesn't have to be perfect. If you are drawing someone then you might want to be more perfect because they might get on you about it. But really, we're just about having fun here and kind of like really expressing ourselves. So now that I've got that all in there, the next step is to move on to colored pencils. So the first one I'm going to go to is 927 here. It's called Light Peach. And this skin tone is kind of a peach skin tone. A lot of skin tones can start with this color. It's pretty universal. But what I'm starting with is known as your base color. So for those of you that haven't taken painting courses or anything like that, the base color is the first color you put down. Now, if I'm working in oils, it's going to be a dark color, and I'll work from dark to light. But since I'm working in colored pencils, I'm actually going to work in the opposite way. Just because, the darker you go, you're kind of like stuck with whatever color you put down. So if you start off light, it's much more forgiving. And I'm even going to just erase just slightly so that these lines don't show through as much. All right. So I'm going to kind of zero in around the eye here, and even start to fill in behind that eyebrow. It's totally okay, because if you notice in the picture, you can see the skin underneath the hair. So the more colors you layer, the better. The more depth you will give your drawing and the more realistic it will look. And we're not going for super realism here. This is going to have a sketchy quality to it. So don't worry about being super polished. If that is the kind of thing you want to do, that requires a lot more time than what we're doing here. But I personally love doing that kind of stuff as well. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and sharpen. And continue to fill here. So what you want to do is really just fill up your whole area unless you see areas that are light or white. And those areas are the parts that you're going to want to just sort of leave open. And if you notice, right underneath the eyebrow, there's a little bit of white area. I'm going to leave that fairly faint just by applying less pressure to it. And then as I come down and I get toward that red area, I'm going to go a little bit darker and over here too as well. And you'll notice, so we're using vellum paper, and this was listed in the bundle as well. Depending on the kind of paper you use, it might have a different kind of tooth or texture to it. Excuse me. This one has a little bit of a tooth to it, so it's kind of nice. I like that. But you can also do this on Bristol Smooth or some other kind of paper that, even I wouldn't recommend canvas paper for color pencils, but having a little bit of tooth is nice. And you can see some streaks in here, but you can use a blender or just another color pencil, even a lighter one, to kind of take care of that. All right, so I'm going to keep going here. Now I'm leaving the blue eyelid. I'm not touching that because that is so blue that I'm not seeing any of this peach color underneath. And again, putting more pressure on the darker part, especially where it's red. And then less pressure around where there's lighter areas. All right. And I'm going to leave that blue streak just like that. And the direction of your shading is really up to you. Right now I'm doing a scribble shading technique. And the direction is sort of following the dimensions of the face, around the eye. But, I personally like that as opposed to just kind of going in one direction all the way, but it's really a preference thing. Oh, and it looks like somebody asked a question about what pencil I was using to make the sketch, and that was the 2H Prismacolor turquoise pencil. All right, so I've got some light areas here. If you notice, I'm not pressing as hard on the paper. But then going a little bit harder to the left. And now I'm going to come down here, tapering off right where that blue starts. And coming around this way. And following around to the right-hand side as well. And this color, this peach tone, it is in the skin, but there is actually a little bit of it in the eye itself, the white of the eye. So I'll get to that kind of right after this. And when you're drawing, excuse me, you'll notice it leaves some wax behind when you're using colored pencils. You can blow on it. If you rub it with your hand, you got to be careful because it might streak on the white part of your artwork. So, those are two ways that you could do just to use what you have handy to get rid of that. Okay, so I'm going to move on here. Get a little bit of that tear duct in there. And then also the edge of the eye has some of this color as well. And put a little bit here on the white of the eye. I'm going very lightly at first, and then I'll get darker as it gets into the darker areas around the edges. And then the right-hand side, continue the same thing. There's a little bit of pink over here. And usually if I were to go straight with pink, it just doesn't look as layered as it would if I start with another lighter color underneath. All right. So I basically got my peach tone down. All right, now I'm going to move on to the next color, which is PC 1034, Goldenrod. If you notice in this skin tone, it isn't just peach, there are some gold tones as well. So if I go in lightly on top of that color, it starts to give it some gold tones, which is nice. But it still keeps that peach tone. And you might notice that some parts of the skin that you're drawing, some might have gold hues, some might have blue hues. This is an opportunity to go in really lightly with that color and just add it to the skin tone where it's needed. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a little bit where the eyebrow is because most of that's going to be covered up by hair. And I'm going to put a little bit here, right below the eyebrow, too. And then I'm not going to worry so much about that red area because, you know, none of that gold's going to show through there, but just the rest of the surrounding area. All right, so now what I'm doing is I'm building these up, these colors. These are both kind of base colors, I would say, since we're not really into the darker midtones or the shadows. And those are that's just terminology from painting that I'm kind of carrying over here. So the next thing I'm going to do is move on to a midtone for the skin. So that one is PC 943, which is burnt ochre. It's a nice brown, kind of an earthy brown, and it lets you kind of, you know, get these nice transitions. I'm going to hold up the picture so you can see it a little bit better if you don't have it with you, but there's some browns in there. So I'm going to start actually kind of right there. And I'm going lightly. And what I recommend doing is when you're looking at your reference to squint. So like, you know, sometimes when you're looking directly at something, you can get bogged down by too many details. And whenever you're recreating anything, I recommend that you kind of don't worry about the details yet. Start off with big, bold shapes and colors. And if you squint your eyes, that's what you'll see. You'll be able to kind of make out all the general shapes and colors in your reference that you can use for your art. So I'm leaving the eyebrow for now. Kind of moving on to some shadow over here. And, you know, I think one thing too that to be careful of is don't go too dark at first. You can always go darker later. So if you feel like, oh, it might be too light, but sometimes it's hard to tell until you have another part of the artwork next to it, how light or dark something is supposed to be. And a good example of that is when you look at, like if you look at the tip of your pencil, that brown is a lot darker than the one that's going down the paper. All right, so I'm putting a little bit of shadow down here. Adding a little bit more shadow to the skin on the right-hand side. And now I'm going to take this color and actually start on the hair follicles. Because if you notice with the hair, the eyebrow, there's some brown and black. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and draw in these hairs, the hair follicles. Because that way I get my texture. I'm not trying to be perfect. I'm not going to sit here and figure out, okay, that one's longer than that one. This is really kind of an expressive way to do it. But again, if that were something I was doing and I wanted to have something look completely photographic, then I would be more concerned with those details. So I'm just going ahead, getting in some of those eyebrow hairs with the brown, the dark umber. So someone's asking about the pencils, what kind are these? So these are Prismacolor color pencils, Prismacolor Premier color pencils, I should say. They're a soft core wax-based pencil, and they're really nice for doing this kind of blending. The fact that they're wax-based makes them really good for mixing them together and getting nice smooth transitions. So, all right, so I'm moving on to the right here and just kind of following the hair follicles. You notice they kind of go from, this direction, and then as you go to the right, they get a little further out, more of a swoop downward. So I'm going to go ahead and add that too. All right. So now I've got all that in there. And I'm going to move on to PC 926 now. And this is really because I want to start getting in this color, this red color, where the makeup is to the top right. So I go in and put a decent amount of pressure there, and actually just release the pressure a little bit toward the edges. It gives me some nice transitions. Now you could, like I said, use a blender, which Prismacolor makes a colorless blender. I can't remember if it's in the bundle or not, but it's nice because I can go over this stuff and blend these in with each other much better. You could also use like a lighter color pencil. I've used white in the past to blend colors. One issue with that is that it tends to lighten the color and kind of takes away the richness of it a little bit. So it's really just a personal preference. Or if you're using a textured paper like this, you might like that. You might like that the transition isn't smooth, which I kind of do in this case. And just leave it the way it is. So, all right, I'm gonna go ahead and finish that red part. And it's not as dark as it will be, because we're gonna add a little bit more red. All right, so now that I've done that, I'm actually gonna put a little bit here also, because right at the top of the eyelid, there's some red there too. All right. Okay, now I've got my red. All right, so now I'm going to move on to 924, so that red and that brown, I would consider those midtones. Now I'm going to go in with a little bit of shadow. So this 924 is a nice dark red. You might be wondering why I didn't just go with this first. The reason is like I said, it gives you a lot more depth by using both. So I'm going to have it taper out, kind of fade out as I get further out from the center. And it gets darker as I get closer to this part of the eyelid. So, and the person that asked about these, kind of whether they were pastel or not, they do have a pastel quality to them, I would say, just with the treatment. So that's a really good question. All right, I got a little bit of red that comes over here too. Okay. So now that I'm done with that part, I'm done with that part. I'm going to move on to this blue of the eye a little bit. So it's a really bright blue, and I picked two colors that I think are going to work really well. One is light aqua, it's PC922, and the other one is peacock blue, 1027. But I'm going to start with the light aqua just because it's the lighter color of the two. So if you notice, there's like some light blues, dark blues, and if you want to go in with a different kind of blue, that's great. But there really are very little highlights here, so most of it is pretty much dense color. I'm going to go ahead and fill that in. And then don't worry about these eyelashes and stuff like that. We're going to take care of that at the end. So fill this in. This is pretty much my base color for the really saturated blue here. All right. And then I'm going to follow around here too. Fill that in. And I'm using a lot of pressure just because I want to get it filled. There's a little bit of lightness here at the top, so I'll leave that, you know, kind of lighter. And I'll especially leave it lighter when I put in the other blue. All right, I'm going to sharpen my pencil. I'm using electric sharpener. I love it. It's an X-Acto. I'm not sure the exact model, but it's a stand-up one. But you could use, you know, any kind of sharpener, even just a little handheld metal sharpener is great. All right, so I'm doing the same down here. I'm actually going to go ahead and draw on this line because it makes it easier for me to fill it. So if I go ahead and take this blue and create a line for the bottom of the eye, it gives me an idea of where to start, essentially. All right. All right, so I'm going to go ahead. I'm going in with a decent fill here. You know, putting a decent amount of pressure, I should say. Continue over to the left. And you might think that this looks like a greenish blue. It is. The other blue we're going to put on top is more of almost a on the purple end of blue. So when they mix together, they make a really nice, rich blue. All right, so here I'm going to bring in this, that little bit of blue right there. All right, so that's done. But I'm also going to use this blue for the eye as well. So since the eye and this, you know, blue liner are very close, I'm just going to use the same one for both. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create the pupil outline. And going in the direction of the pupil, if you notice, you know, those lines, I'm just going to use the same direction with my pencil to get those kind of strokes. Because I'm going to build this up just like everything else. But with this direction and this texture, it helps me create that look, like those details without actually going in and putting in each little detail of that eye. And something to think about, this one kind of works this way, but I've always thought of an eye shape um, as almost like comparing it to moonlight over water. So if you look at like this highlight, that highlight is kind of like the moon, and it will leave a reflection on the bottom part of the eye, just like that. So it doesn't always work out that perfectly, but if you want to just draw an eye out of your head, that's kind of a cool trick. All right. So I've got that in there. And I'm actually going to go in with a little bit of that, excuse me, Carmine Red PC926 with the white of the eye because there is some red in there. And just go very lightly. And there's a highlight right there, so I'm going to leave that almost white. And if you notice, I'm using the pressure of the pencil to create this detail. So I'm putting in a little bit of shadow here just by going in gently, tapering out, and then I'll do the same over here. You know, this is darker than what I'm doing, but I'm just basically laying down some colors underneath. Okay. Excuse me. So now that I've got that down, I'm going to go in with my next blue, which is Peacock Blue 1027. I'm going to sharpen it a little bit just so I have a decent point. And any area that's black, don't worry about that right now. We're going to go with blacks later. But you know, I'm going to mix some of this even with the red to get kind of this sort of purpley color that's there. And get some of my shadow. And then when I get to here, I can start making this blue much of a deeper blue than it was before. All right, following this down here. So now I'm starting in with my eyelid. And you know, you'll notice along the way, you're like, well, this doesn't look really like the picture at all. And the reason being is because, well, we haven't gotten to the darkest parts yet. I would almost say that like the black is once you put black in, that's what really drives it home. It's like, whoa, there's actually something I'm doing here. Whereas right now, it almost looks like we're just drawing some shapes with colors in them. You know, if any of you used Photoshop and you played around with the channels, you can take a look at a way that at least on screen, colors separate, and like the way you would do like a silk screen almost. And that's kind of what we're doing here. We're just deconstructing it. So, you know, kind of working backwards and figuring out, okay, so how many colors are in this and what are they and where do I start? So if you just look into these, you can kind of like break it up, your blue into two blues or your red into two reds. The more you do this kind of thing, if you haven't done it, the easier that gets. And it just becomes really intuitive. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and sharpen a little more. Now here, I'm going to start working on creating shadows. So if you notice, there's like a lighter area at the top, putting my hand right over it, lighter area at the top of the lower eyelid. And I'm gonna fake that just first by starting with right above where it's darker. And then here, I'm kind of changing the direction of my stroke because I want to get that texture in there. So if I go up and down, I kind of get a nice texture. I'm going lightly at first and then darker wherever I see fit. So, you know, it's kind of darker in some of the areas with the eyelashes, but not being too perfect. And also squinting while looking at the reference to see, okay, well, that definitely needs to be darker blue than what I have right now. Okay, so continue this. Over to the right. And then I'm gonna go in a little bit darker here just to push it. Okay, so now that I've got that down, I'm going to go ahead and start working on the eyeball, the pupil again. So here, same thing. I'm going to leave some lighter areas toward the bottom, because I want that sort of reflection look. Basically, I'm putting in lines, excuse me, broke a pencil, with some space in between them. And then as I get closer to the top, I will decrease that space for the illusion of darkness and light. And actually, if you look toward the center, there's some darker areas there, and there's darker areas around the edge too. So I'm kind of skipping around, but I'm doing that just basically to show you the different ways that you can use shading to create shapes and depth and textures and all that good stuff. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and draw that line around. And I got sort of my darker blue in the center, lines here. Okay, and then up here, almost completely filled, and then work down into lines again. So don't worry about the middle. We're going to do that later. But what you can do is, what I'm going to do right now is just put in a placeholder for that highlight. All right. So now I'm going to go ahead and put a little blue in the shadow, because basically whenever you have an eye, a drawing of an eye, a picture of an eye, there's a shadow that drops down from the upper eyelid. I'm putting a little bit of that here in the white. And even some that's sort of cast underneath. I'm going to darken here with the blue too, because there's some shadow right there. Same thing with this. I'm actually going to go ahead with this crimson red, go a little bit darker here, because once I've gone in with these other colors, I've noticed that this really isn't as dark as it should be. And that's kind of the cool thing about this, is when you're creating, like I said earlier, the more you put in there, the more you're going to know where to work from, just because it gives you a point of reference. All right. So now I'm going to start with the black. So this one is black, PC935, and start with the eyebrow. And again, if I squint, I can see that there's lighter hair on the left, but it becomes more dense kind of right around here. So I'm going to go ahead and just start off lightly. And the one thing about black color pencil is sometimes when you color over other colors, it doesn't turn out as dark as you might want it to, which is one of the reasons I included that black art marker, because we're going to use that at the end here to sort of get our real blacks in there. It just can end up kind of light, the colored pencil can, so and look almost like a gray. So if you can see what I'm doing here, just kind of putting it in darker where it is darker. All right, so that's that part. Just continuing on with that. Doing more of the same kind of shading. And I'm doing a combination of scribble shading and hatching. Hatching is just where you're just drawing lines. And the lines give you the effect of the hair, but the scribble shading kind of fills in the black where you need it. So it gives the illusion that it's hair, but then putting in just more of the scribble shading adds more shadow to the eyebrow. All right. So, and again, when we're done, we're going to do some finishing touches, but that's something you can always do later as well. I know sometimes when you're drawing, you can get excited about having the one part be done. Like, you know, you might think, oh God, I really want that eyeball done. You can do that first. I just prefer to do this kind of working from top to bottom. It's really your call. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and start working in shadows of this upper eyelid. So there's a nice black shadow that comes down here. And also over here. And I'm going lightly at first, and then adding more pressure to where it gets really dark. And then for right around the eye, I'm going to go in pretty heavy here. I'm not worried about the eyelashes yet, because the nice thing is that I've got a pretty good solid line of black that comes down here before I even start adding any eyelashes that I can get into here. All right. And then sharpen and start adding these eyelashes. And again, if they're not as dark as you want them to be, don't worry about it. We're going to go in with some marker afterward and really make it pop. And, you know, I also don't worry about these being perfect. You can make up your own eyelashes if you want to, as long as it's believable. I think that's part of the difference between what I consider to be illustration versus fine art, at least my fine art. Where with my fine art, I don't get as, I guess, imaginative with the depiction of things. Other people definitely do in their fine art, whereas my illustration is definitely more exaggerated. So this is something that I would consider almost like illustration for that reason. And I think that that line between illustration and fine art has blurred over the years. All right, so I'm just adding some eyelashes here, a little bit more over here. And I'm also noticing that as I'm doing it, I might want to go in with some more dark blue here in the blue area. But I'm going to keep going with the black for now. All right, and there's some eyelashes that sort of have a little bit of shape over the eyeball. So I'll add that. A little more shadow over here. Same here. Okay, so I'm going to get a little bit more definition here to the bottom of the eye, and then start putting in my other eyelashes at the bottom. So as you can see, what I'm doing is just drawing in the direction of the eyelash lines. Pretty straightforward. But, you know, just watch to see that you're not going and making them too bold in certain areas, because you notice like there's a couple of really bold ones in the middle. So I'll make some bold ones there, and then the rest are just sort of thin. All right. And so now, before I get into putting more of that blue in there, I'm going to go ahead and start working on the center of the eye. All right, sharpen. And then here, I'm going to start with a circle, but what you'll notice is in this picture, the black continues outward a little bit. So I'll get to that once I go in and start filling it up. Draw around this highlight. So what's nice about that little bit of blue that I drew the circle with is that it gives you a little bit more of a haze to the highlight that isn't just black, right, black, straight black to white. And I'm actually just making it a full highlight as opposed to that picture that has some, looks like some eyelash cast shadow on it. So I'll fill this up with black. And, you know, I work digitally and analog like this too. And sometimes I do wish I could just drop a paint bucket of black in an area. All right. So I've got this black in the middle. Now I'm gonna finesse it by shading here first. So I've got basically, I'm using the same shape as this iris, you know, the details there for the edges. And then I'm going to do the same here because there is also that effect in the picture around the edges of the eye. So in case you were wondering, now you see that once you start adding black, that's really when it all comes together. And then occasionally you get an extra shot of black right there in the white. If that happens, you can put a little white pencil over that, and that will usually take care of it mostly. It might leave a little bit of a gray ghosting, but it's not the end of the world, you know. And also, Prismacolor does make color erase marker or color erase pencils that are erasable, that I believe Michaels has available as well. All right, so now what I'm doing is just putting a little bit of shadow on the rest of the people that is cast by the eyelid and carrying that down. And then there's a little bit of shadow here. A little bit more of a nice transition there around the edges. And there. So, you know, you can go back in. Sometimes you can move colors around. Like there's a little extra black there that I didn't like. And I can go over, if I press really hard with a lighter color, I can kind of erase it. And, you know, going back in with this blue will actually allow me to blend a little bit too. So if you see these, this is kind of choppy. Now if I go back with this blue and go over it, it'll blend those colors together really nicely. So it depends on what you want. I'm gonna leave the bottom not blended because I like how it looks, and just leave that at that. And then I'm gonna go up here and add a little bit more black to the top, or sorry, not black, but peacock blue. And then we'll move on to using the marker. So the nice thing is, even though I'm going over the eyelashes, it's not really destroying them. And especially when we go back in with the blue, it won't matter as much. But that's kind of a nice thing too about these color pencils is when you draw over black, it really doesn't do anything to it. It's kind of non-destructive. It might make it slightly lighter, but not by much. Same down here, I'm gonna add a little bit more blue. And that transition a little bit better. So see some areas over here that are kind of like there's some white showing. I can just go over that. All right, so now I'm gonna go in with my marker. So one of the markers, the only marker I think that's included in the bundle is this Prismacolor Premier Art Marker. It's black, and you've got like a chiseled edge, and you've got a fine edge. So I'm going to start with the fine edge just because I want to use that with the eyebrow and the eyelashes. So you'll notice you can draw right over the top of your colored pencil, and it doesn't, I mean, it's visible. And it's especially nice for when you want to get really super black. So it kind of really pushes that black there. Same with the middle. I'm going to do it, you know, just even for the eye. And it actually looks shiny on the camera, but I think it's just because it's wet. Once it dries, it won't be shiny. So same here, I'm going to go ahead and use this black to accentuate some of these eyelashes. And the shadow up there. And anywhere else you see that, you know, you don't think the black color pencil is quite cutting it, just add a little bit more. And then once you're done with all of this, you know, there might be things you want to change. So like, for instance, I'm looking at this picture and I'm seeing the skin, and compared to my picture, there's some more pinks in there. So if you take, you know, a pink color, in this case, I'm just using this handful of colors here, the Carmine Red 926. And now is where I can really just kind of hone in and add a little bit more, you know, realism to it. My skin, you know, the shadow's there, not fully there as it is in the picture. But now I have the opportunity to do that, mostly because I went in light to begin with and I didn't try to go too dark right away. So I've got that. This is kind of helping to create a shadow here. And then I'll bring that over to this side. So I'm adding a little bit more red tone to the skin, which is nice. Same thing up here. So depending on what skin color you're using, you know, obviously, as you all know, if you look in the mirror, skin color is multifaceted. So depending on the lighting, the shadow of the room you're in, you know, whatever, there are so many colors you can pull from different skin tones and figure out from there. So, you know, there's yellow in this one, there's gold, there's brown, there's peach, and there's even a bit of blue. So there's not only the blue from this eye makeup, but there's some blue in the shadow up at the top. So I'm going to go ahead and put some of that in there too. So right up here. The one thing to be careful of is always using black for shadows. So see, for instance, here, I'm using blue. If I were to use black, it can kind of gray things out. I would try to reserve your black just for areas that are really, really dark. So like this part of the eye, this part of the eyelid. This skin is dark, but it's not super dark. So I'm going in with a color instead of black, using this blue. And I might even throw a little bit more of the dark red in there too, which is crimson red, just at the top here. Kind of make that a little bit more purpley. And here too, you know, with this red, there are some darker tones. I'm going to use this blue and just make it a little bit darker in certain areas as opposed to black. It's going to give me a little bit more dimension to that red, like that. And here, as I get closer to where the shadow is above the eyelid. So, and even a little bit more here. Carry that around. And then here, there's a little bit of shadow too. So, like I said, if you use colors as opposed to black, you're going to get a lot more depth. It's not going to look as, especially when you're using skin, try not to use black on the skin. You could make the person look almost like a zombie. So that's one thing to be careful of. And some other tips, just to throw out there is that if you mix a color with its complement color, it's gonna desaturate it a little bit. So let's say like if you had a blue and you wanted to make it a little less bright, like this is, add a little, yellow and red to it or orange, just to kind of tone it down a little bit, as opposed to adding black. It'll make it darker, but it'll also make it a little less vibrant. So if you want something to look more, a lot of times things that are realistic aren't as vibrant as this eye makeup is. You can do that. All right, so just adding some finishing touches here. And a little shadow at the top. And kind of looking around to see wherever else I can add some shadow. So if anybody has any questions, please throw them in the chat and I can try to answer them before we close here. Just going back in, adding some more color for these finishing touches. So someone asked, it looks like, what can we use if we don't have solvent? I'm not sure which kind of solvent you're referring to, just because I personally don't use any kind of solvent when I'm doing color pencil. But I'm sure there is something you can use. And Prismacolor also makes watercolor color pencil, which you wouldn't use a solvent with, but you can use water with, and they work great. And just make one last finishing touch to this eye, just to give it a little bit more shadow. And here you'll notice I'm adding a little black, but it's just to the red part. It's not to the skin tone. The skin tone is where you really want to stay away from your black. And Prismacolor makes a ton of a huge variety of colors that you can use. But I do think that if you can get you can achieve a lot with very little. So like in this case, we blended a few different colors together to get the colors we wanted. So someone asked if Bristol Vellum allows multiple layering. Yes, it does. So that's basically what I did here. I'm not sure if they mean multiple layering, like you can put a picture on top. It wouldn't allow you to do that, but it does allow you to build up your colors. And I do have a colorless blender here, so I can at least show you kind of what that looks like. So for instance, up here, if I use it, on the skin here, you can see the difference. It really spreads it out. It's almost like, becomes more pastel-like in a way. And one thing that's cool to do is once you've done this, is then go ahead and rework it and blend it again. You can get some really nice results that way. And the same here for the eye. If I went in with this, it's almost the same as what I was doing earlier with the color pencil, because basically this is just a color pencil without color. It's wax, the binder. So I think that is pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I know that I want to thank, Prismacolor and Blick for putting this together. It was really fun, and I hope you thought it was fun too. So thank you, everyone.